I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Get In The Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get In The Mecha, and in today's episode we are talking about Wonder Egg Priority and specifically character acting in Wonder Egg Priority. If you are new to the podcast, I'm Jamal. I like to talk about anime and think about it and try to just understand it a bit better through about 20 to 40 minutes of me just struggling to really think about these concepts. But that aside, in this episode we are talking about character acting and why it is really important within such an anime. Wonder Egg Priority is only 3 episodes in right now, but I want to capitalize on the content goldmine that exists at the moment, since it is fairly new and there are some great episodes coming out, so I might as well speak about it. And secondly, I want to talk about something really specific about it and why it is so important in such an anime. I have spoken previously about character acting on the podcast before, but that was a very general look at it. But now we're finally returning to it, as I did say back then. And why this is so important is because it's going to help us understand its practical context or its practical usage within an anime like this. So let us get into the episode for this week. That is the 80 episode actually, so that is episode 80 of Get In The Mecha, a look at character acting in Wonder Egg Priority. As always, I like to give you alerts for spoilers in case there are any, and in this case, there are some. That is, spoilers for Wonder Egg Priority episodes 1 to 3. I'm going to be speaking assuming you've watched most of, if not the series so far, up to episode 3, and I am not really going to attempt to give a whole plot summary, mostly because we're speaking about a very niche area within this, not really niche, but at least it's a very niche focus for an anime and anime analysis generally. And if I was to do a plot summary, I think that would kind of take away some of the point, even though it does relate to narrative, but we'll get to that. But I am assuming you are watching this anime before you are listening to this podcast episode, basically. I like to think of Wonder Egg Priority as a rare sort of anime. It's not as if these types of anime don't exist, and it doesn't have a specific name or anything. This isn't a category or genre, but this links to something within animation discourse often when there's this tendency to speak about or separate shows between action shows and shows with character acting. And it feels like there is some sort of binary difference between the two, and I'm not really saying this critically to those that do it, because I do it myself even within my own head. I'm like, okay, these are the shows with good action animation, these are the ones which I watch for more character acting related animation, and then we have stuff like Wonder Egg Priority which fit in the middle. There aren't many shows that fit in the quote-unquote middle, and it's not to say that they don't have both. Most shows do have both, but the balance is very skewed to one side often. Wonder Egg Priority actually gives me a bit of hope that there are shows that have this amazingly good balance between the two, and doesn't just assume, I say assume as in, it doesn't only make out that action is important, even if it is an action anime. And I suppose it is a bit of a double standard, because depending on the show, say it's a slice of life anime completely, it's very unlikely there's going to be action animation specifically. But in the case of a show that does have some action, as we did find out from the first episode, surprisingly, and the fact that there is a whole action director being Yusuke Kawakami, it admires both and uses them both equally to its advantage. Character acting is often snubbed or not recognized enough, yet it is probably one of the most vital areas of animation in the anime space, really. And that is because it gives us a way into these characters. It is the, I like to call it the dialogue of the body, and that's something which I'm going to be repeating both here throughout the podcast and also on an article which I'll probably write later on Wonder Egg Priority 2. It is basically the dialogue of the body minus the dialogue, obviously, the verbal dialogue. It speaks to us and who we are simply because we can relate, since we move like humans, and when we see characters moving in the same way, we finally understand, or there's a sense of relationship between the viewer and what is being animated, simply because it's something we can relate to. It is what we do in our daily lives. When we have characters that are very hard to crack, the entire premise of Wonder Egg Priority kind of bases itself around not knowing enough about these characters, and it's slowly unraveling through these sort of scenarios of beating these traumas which manifest themselves into physical monsters and beings. As a result, we have to really find a way or have a mechanism into understanding to an extent, or at least trying to understand some characters. And we do this through character acting. What is also amazing about Wonder Egg Priority, or I might even just start calling it WEP, but what is great about WEP is that it gives us the ability to interpret emotions from two sides of the same coin. The coin being animation, we have character acting alongside action. I'm obviously going to be focusing on character acting this episode, but we're able to understand the human character through both. And the human character is what is so central to an anime like this, because it bases itself around how to handle trauma, how do we manage pain within our own lives. To understand why character acting is so important to Wonder Egg Priority, I think we have to understand how it is made up and how it is constructed as structurally even. And that is through this back and forth between the present and these flashbacks as to when Koito was alive, and then it goes back to the present. And as a result, we're given very limited time with some of these characters. Koito is probably the main one in this circumstance, but we also have Ai, who we only see for very short periods of time, too, also within these flashbacks. But we have to remember that this is Ai from the past, who might have a very different outlook to life. And my point is that when we have such limited time, character acting works almost as a shorthand or a way of bypassing giving information through dialogue only. Yes, that also does add to the intrigue, but I would say a big reason why character acting in Wonder Egg Priority is important is that it doesn't really want to or have the time to tell us everything within these people's lives, or at least it's reserving it for later on. And so by giving us these visual cues, by just, a slight toss of the arm, like in episode 2 when Koito does rip up that piece of clothing and then throw it into the ground or throw it on the ground, it's small things like that which give us an understanding as to how she is feeling, not just through expressions and through, again, dialogue, but how it looks. So how is it smeared? It's smeared to kind of make it seem like she doesn't care, when ironically it's something like bullying, which we would argue most of the time that the person does care that they are being bullied. But the interesting thing with Koito and why she is so difficult to crack is that she seems at times like she doesn't care about this and she's simply after evidence and stuff like that, or just not caring, but at the same time she's upset by this too. So there's this weird contradictory thing there, and I think character acting gives us an insight into this, but it also deceives us in a way. We have to remember that this is an anime that concerns trauma, and what is so hard to understand about trauma is that it doesn't simply manifest itself on the surface, or at least everyone shows or illustrates their own trauma in different ways. Some people simply suppress it. Some people just manage to not show it at all. Other people show it right there and then in front of you. It's very difficult to peel back these layers. And I think there is one device that lets us do this, which is character acting. When we think of characters like Rika or Ai, they in themselves have very different ways of approaching this. Ai manages to sort of transmutate her feelings from what are usually quite hurt and stunned to eventually anger and it kind of manifests that into helping others, whereas on like Rika just decides to completely hide it and act as if she kind of supplements it with rudeness and also just a sense of arrogance or confidence at times. There's quite a blurry line between the two, and as I'll explain later, these are our way of actually getting to know these characters rather than this longer dialogue of who are you, where do you come from, what are you doing here, what trauma do you have, but it's as simple as it's showing us rather than telling us. I really just love the approach, whether it is Wakabayashi, the director, or any of the episode directors and storyboarders on this project. They want us to care about this type of animation, and not exclusively care about the action of which it leads up to. Animating the character doing normal human-like things is just as important as animating them in circumstances to which we usually wouldn't be involved in, and it allows us to relate and really dive into this anime. Even if there are elements that are maybe a bit more unrelatable, as in them fighting monsters with these blades, this isn't something we can relate to, but we can relate to them running away from things that they dislike, or simply reacting to things on a very small level when things happen, and you see it within their hands and their faces as well. Like, it allows these characters to just not really feel too far apart from us, and I think that's a very important thing for the message of One Direct Priority, or WEP, which is trauma is something that lives within all of us, and it really gets the audience in there when they understand that these are also people, and okay, yes, they are constructed characters, but we're not that different from them on a very fundamental human level. Now let's get into the actual technicalities and the meat of this episode, which is really the animators, or some of the animators I want to highlight in regards to character acting. I'm not going to go through as many as I would on a normal animation analysis episode, although I will, maybe, I hope so, in the future do a full-on animation analysis when this series is over, even though there will be SSSS Dynazen on too, so I don't know how that's going to work out, but I do intend to do an animation analysis on One Direct Priority when it's over, because we will get a bit of a fuller scope of these staff and their roles within this anime. But instead, I've only highlighted two staff which I think have really stood out for this 3-episode run so far. One of the animators I would say that really helps us get into this when it comes to character acting animation and just helping us to understand the character and the human element a bit more is Leaf, or Ken Yamamoto. Leaf is very famous for their lengthier timings, or their use of lengthier timings, and the reason why they are so famous for doing this is because it simply works when they do it, because they have an amazing sense of spacing as well, alongside just the timing it's on. Leaf opens episode 3, which episode 3 starts with the water scene and all of that, but the main part I want to focus on is the stuff with Rika when we first meet her, sort of at the very first instance of the episode. Probably the most memorable cut to me from episode 3 and from Leaf within One Direct Priority was when we have Kawaii who's in the sand, or Rika who's in the sand, and she pulls her hands inwards and the sand sort of moves outwards as she clenches her fists again within the sand. And it sounds rather simple and basic, but what is so fascinating about such a cut is that you'd expect for a hand cut to go through the sand that it would take quite a few drawings to do this, but it's actually it only consists of 3 main unique drawings. Not exactly 3, I'm pretty sure it's about 5 or 6, because of the jitters of the hand as they do like come inwards, and because they're being compressed they sort of come out at the same time. But overall, it's just fascinating to know that such a thing can be done in such such a minimal amount of drawings. It also gives us a really good sense of this pent-up tension which exists within her, and something which she then refuses to show as the episode goes on. It has a sense of urgency, but it also communicates a sense of, it shows a lack of friction. I guess that does go to show this energy and anger which exists within her, this almost self-hatred, as we manage to discover throughout episode 3 as well. What I love about Leaf's work generally is that it goes against the grain, sort of. I don't mean this as in there aren't animators that don't use such lengthier timings, but Leaf really embraces it as that's kind of what they're known for, I would say, by using these sorts of timings like fours and such. They don't only have their animations stand out within the episodes, but additionally, they pay off nicely for the very thing which they're going for. And in the case of this third episode of Web, it is kind of to unravel this self-hatred that exists within Rika, and we're given that from the first 30 seconds of the episode alone. Another animator that I do want to mention is Keisuke Kobayashi, and Kobayashi's work will eventually springboard us into a larger discussion about some of the general staff within this anime. I won't be able to again mention everyone because of time limitations, as I always say, but Kobayashi does represent at least what I really love about most of the character acting within this anime. Kobayashi's work really stood out to me in the area of run cycles. So run cycle being kind of self-explanatory, a cyclical run. So it's a set of movements that repeats to show a run. What is so great about this isn't just how they are animated, but how they adapt to the context. And I suppose this is also a storyboarding / direction point as well, but I love how they are very different, and they are all dependent on what is being run from or what is being run to, alongside the stakes which exist within the episode. At the end of episode 1, for example, when Ai is running towards the tunnel, the very mysterious tunnel in fact, we get the impression that it's some sort of light jog. It does have a sense of urgency, but it also does have a quite cute feeling as well, where the arms aren't fully coming outwards and swaying left and right extremely, but they are coming out to an extent and the body is still leaning forward. In the middle of episode 1, however, when they are running from the mini chainsaw minion things, I honestly don't remember the names for them. I think they refer to them as bystanders, if I am correct. But when she's running away from these, there's a much more flaily or flail-like motion, as if she is running, yes, but it kind of comes from a place of fear as well. It comes across as a lot more panicked when arms are stretched outwards and they're sort of pointing horizontally, as opposed to moving vertically. It comes out of a place of not knowing what to do, rather than a lot more intentional run, which is pointing forwards or is striding forwards, because there's an understanding of what to get to. There's usually an objective there. It's not to say that there wasn't an objective to escape, but it kind of came out of nowhere. So this newly found objective, there's not much of a point as to having arms flailing forward, basically. It's quite... this is probably the only podcast where you hear someone talk about why someone's arms should flail forward as opposed to should be on their sides. I'm not critiquing it, by the way. I'm saying it's a good thing, but my point is, if there's something you have to take from that kind of weird conversation we just had there, character acting is very dependent on context. And I think that is what is so important about it. And I'm not really doing this as an adverse criticism to action animation, but I feel like sometimes it is potentially a bit more... action does come across as a bit less context dependent. I think if an action scene can look good, it kind of meets its context anyway. I feel like character acting is very dependent on context, and if you miss that I don't want to say if you miss it, it shows, but it can come across as a lot more, it comes across as better for the scene and a lot more intentional and attentive if context is met. If I was to just pull out a very small hypothetical, if we were to have this very intense run where legs were fully extended and arms were flailing back and forth in a very focused direction and way, and that was the way of running in literally every episode or within every run cycle, we would lose a lot more nuance that the anime attempts to provide, which is, again, context is everything, and for us to understand these characters a lot more and just kind of to give them the level of depth they deserve emotionally and mentally, I think it is right that we do have these very context-dependent character acting moments, and Wonder Egg Priority understands this, which I really love. I feel almost listened to when watching webs sometimes. So many of these animators are on the team for Wonder Egg Priority, or many of these key animators just understand this. And that doesn't even include the key animators. I mean the directors and storyboarders as well, alongside Kobayashi too. There's a very good understanding as to why animation matters for telling stories. We're in a climate where we have many people saying that this show is sort of carried by its animation. It only has good animation, but animation is just as integral for telling these stories, and Wonder Egg Priority really proves that to us, that how something is animated is part of the story in itself. And I do like to think that some people do blur the line or create too much of a distinction between animation and narrative, or story and animation, or story and art, but art is part of the story which is being told to us, and to sort of let that go misses out, to me, a lot of what anime can do. And something like Wonder Egg Priority tells us that character acting is so important because it is an integral part for understanding what trauma is to these characters and how they manage the pain and trauma which exists within their lives. This podcast episode, to be honest, was basically to tell you that character acting is important, and I will continue to stress it for as long as Get In The Mecha is running. I can't say that I'm going to do it every episode or something, but I want to continue to stress that this is a very integral part of animation. Animation isn't only how characters are animated in intense moments, and with it is that, but it's not only when they're conflicting with one another, but it is how they process the world and how it is animated, how the animator acts the character getting to grips with the world too. It tests our inference skills as an audience to perceive or get to grips with these visual codes and cues from these characters, which aren't particularly so obvious. They're much more subtle, but can really add a lot more value to the audience experience as a result, if we actually take initiative to understand these. Wonder Egg Priority, being the mysterious anime it is, utilizes character acting perfectly with these very multifaceted and layered characters. We're put in a situation where we really have to try and understand them through their motions and mannerisms, as opposed to just what they say and what is shown to us on screen. It is our window into the state of mind of Ai and Rika and Neiru and Koito and anyone else within this show. That is the analysis for this week. I'm actually not going to do a segment this week. I was thinking about talking about Idly Pride this week, but I did realize that this was a very content-heavy episode. It was a lot of things being thrown at your ears, basically, and I don't think it would be very fair if I was just to talk about Idly Pride for 5 minutes. That can wait. It is a decent anime. I do recommend it, even though I don't really give very good recommendations. But if you do want to watch Idly Pride, just know that I like it, and I will be talking about it online as well. I don't know if I'll talk about it on the podcast as a whole episode dedicated to Idly Pride, but that is a good anime. And you know what else is good? Wonder Egg Priority. So, but now let's actually get to closing thoughts, and I just want to briefly wrap up what I've said in this episode, basically. Character acting animation has always been important, and I've stressed that for a while now, but it is especially important in an anime like Wonder Egg Priority, which focuses around the mystery of these characters and their trauma. Such animations, everything from how they move their hands to how they walk around the room, is a sign to some extent as to how they patch up or protect or even just show what they're going through. Rika is probably my favorite example of this, as it is pretty much the opposite of what you would, I don't say opposite of what you would expect, because there are obviously people within this world that handle trauma like that, and I am not putting myself against those people. That is a perfectly justified way to demonstrate your trauma. But in the case of Rika, we get a very blasé looking approach. However, internally, this is actually a much darker one. So everything from Leaf's opening sequence, when we have on estimate 3 drawings for the hand moving through the sand shot, to moments later on where she's grabbing fruits that technically aren't hers within the fruit container and stuff like that. So she's a really great example of this, and my overall point is that we get to grips with these characters and what they're hiding and what they're showing through character acting. Thank you for listening to this episode this week. That has been episode 80 of the podcast. 20 episodes away from 100 doesn't sound real, but I'm just gonna put that to one side for now, forget about it until we actually get there. But thank you for listening. I hope you did enjoy this episode. And I haven't spoken about a newer anime for a really long time. I think the last time I did this was It Invaded, maybe? I think It Invaded was the closest thing I spoke about when it comes to like seasonals and stuff. I don't usually speak about seasonals because it's a bit hard to talk about something which has only been on for 3 or so episodes, but even so, it was a blast to talk about this, and I hope you did get some value from it going forward into the anime, or maybe you've even finished the anime and we're 2 years into the future. I don't know, but thank you for listening. I don't know what I'm recording next week. Maybe more Sakuga related content. I hope so even. I have been your host Shmal today. Have a great day, have a great week, enjoy your weekend, and also please stay safe. I have been your host Shmal today, and this has been Get In The Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows: Synthwave by Alex McCulloch, Mandatory Overtime by Joth, and Difference by Chasersgaming.